a guest speaker at Grace Church, and so it's been a while since we've had her back. But at the time she was director of Youth for Christ here in this town. Now she's working for a charity called Mary's Meals. Hannah's one of my heroes because she has a determined commitment to follow God and to serve Him, and she's a great blessing to many, many people. So I wonder if, as Hannah comes and speaks to us, I wonder whether we could give her the biggest Grace Church welcome possible.
Yeah. It's flashing, is it? Yeah. I don't think it should be flashing.
We good? Morning, everybody. So good to see you. So good to see so many old faces. Yeah, some lovely, not old in that sense, some old friends and some new faces. So thank you so much for having me here. Thank you, Helen, for that beautiful time of worship. I probably should have been saving my voice, but I wasn't, so forgive me. I'm just going to check that all works. Yeah, great. My name's Hannah, and you may have known me as Centre Director at Shrewsbury Youth for Christ, which I am still a very proud supporter of, and is now in the very able and very capable hands of Ellie, I was going to say Harper, but Ellie Lord, who now runs the show, and it's just a privilege to see, and a delight to see Shrewsbury Youth for Christ thriving under that new leadership. If you didn't know, before my time at Youth for Christ, I spent 3 years living in Zambia. And so for me, coming to Mary's Meals is kind of like, coming full circle in a sense. And I'm going to share a little about Mary's Meals with you this morning. But it is your harvest service this morning. And I don't know about you, I didn't grow up in an Anglican church where, I don't know, they just do harvest really well, don't they, as Anglicans in the city. It's just part of their church calendar, and it's a festival that they just celebrate really well, whereas we didn't always growing up. So in my mind, when I think of harvest festivals, I don't know about you, but I think of those lovely old churches and the bread made into like ears of wheat, and it's all glistening, and there's piles of homegrown vegetables, and that's what I kind of imagine when I think of a harvest festival. I forgot to look at my watch. I've been given half an hour. I won't go over that. I might just have to cut short if I haven't finished. But me growing up in more evangelical free church, harvest wasn't that image. It was just, I don't know, a few sad looking tins of baked beans. I don't know if it was the same experience for you. It wasn't that beautiful image. And so I think that in our tradition, in kind of the non-Anglican tradition, we don't do harvest very well. And it's not something that I really kind of have much knowledge of. So I did what all of us do when we want to know a bit more about something. And I Googled it, and I found something on BBC Bitesize. So if you're studying for your GCSEs and you've got an RE exam coming up, this might be helpful for you. But it says that the purpose of this festival, the Harvest Festival, is not only to thank God for the abundance of food many of us enjoy, but also to raise awareness of the hunger that exists in other parts of the world. So that's what we're broadly going to do this morning. We are going to thank God for all He has given us, not just in terms of food, but just His many good gifts that He lavishes on us freely, as we've talked about this morning so beautifully in our kind of worship and words. And then we are going to look at briefly at hunger in this world, and kind of particularly Mary's Meals' response to that. And the story of Mary's Meals is actually framed by an encounter with a generous God. And I'll tell you about that later. But an encounter with a generous God that led to a change and a generous life. And that's what we're going to focus on this morning. A generous God who gives not only good gifts of food, which we love. I'm a foodie, and I thank God for the gift of food every single day, but all the other wonderful gifts that he's given us. It says in Ephesians, in him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses, according to the riches of his grace, which he lavished upon us. I love that grace that he lavished. He didn't give stingingly. He didn't give reluctantly. He lavished. And that's the generous God that we're going to talk about this morning. I'm just going to turn really briefly to a story that's really familiar to us all. We've known this story probably through Sunday school, but I think it's worthy of repeating this morning as we think of our generous God and our generous response to his lavish gifts. So Zacchaeus, the tax collector. We're reading from Luke 19, verses 1 to 10, if anyone wants to follow along. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but being a short man, he could not because of the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed up a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. Oh, there we go. We've got an added version here. I must stay at your house today. So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, he has gone to be the guest of a sinner. But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save what was lost. So we have there the story of Zacchaeus, and forgive me, we don't have much time to go super deep into that story today. We're just going to use it as an example, really, of an encounter with a generous God. Zacchaeus was a sinner. It was obvious to all around. It was, I'm fairly certain, obvious to Zacchaeus himself. And he could have quite rightly expected to find in Jesus judgment, or at the very least, grace and forgiveness that was kind of stingy and kind of given reluctantly. And that's kind of the situation that we sometimes find ourselves in when we're faced with those people who are like the lousiest and the worst of sinners. I don't know, there's that human thing that wants to give grudgingly our forgiveness. And yet we see in Jesus, in this story, such a generous giver who lavished his gift. He was generous in reaching out, in seeking out Zacchaeus, where others would have judged him and condemned him. Jesus was generous in reaching out and saying, I'm coming to you, Zacchaeus. Where others would have given judgment, Jesus gave a gift. He invited him into his house, and he continued to lavish gifts on him, gifts of salvation and forgiveness. And Zacchaeus, after that encounter with this generous God who gave so freely of himself, his life was instantly changed, and he gave back generously. And in Zacchaeus' case, that was financially, because that's the way he'd kind of taken. But it isn't always that way. We see through the Bible, don't we, countless stories of people who meet with a generous God. Generous in healing, generous in provision, generous in grace, generous in forgiveness, generous in love. we see, don't we, countless times, encounters with that Jesus who is so generous. And people are changed by encountering that generous God. And then they give, don't they? Not just financially, but we see, don't we, transform lives throughout Scripture of people who meet with this generous God and give back in different ways. And that's the same for people in this room today. And I know it because I know some stories, but I also know it because I know that I've encountered that generous God. We've all got stories, haven't we, where we've met with a generous God who's given to us lavishly, where we don't even deserve it. And our response to that is to give generously back. We give, don't we? We give of ourselves financially. We give of ourselves in service. We give generously back in hospitality. And that's something that I've seen that you give so generously here at Grace Church, your hospitality, in service, in forgiving others, in love, in all of the ways that we have received from a generous God. We give back generously to him through lives changed. And that's the story of so many people, and that's the story of ourselves. And the story that I want to give you of Mary's Meals today goes way back than what I was going to tell you originally. And there was a man who encountered a generous God as a teenager, Magnus. He was, I think, maybe like 15 or 16 at the time. And he went on somewhat of a pilgrimage to a place called Medjugorje in Bosnia. And there he had an encounter with God. He had a very real encounter with the living God. And he encountered that generosity of God in Medjugorje in Bosnia as just a young teenager. And that encounter with God changed his life. And he gave back generously. Maybe not in the way that he probably would have expected, but that was kind of the formation of this story. But I'm going to tell you briefly about the rest of the story of Mary's Meals. Because in 1992, this young lad, Magnus, and his brother Fergus, I mean, they're from Scotland, if you didn't guess from the names already. Magnus and Fergus, from a small village in Dalmally, which is just north of Loch Lomond in Scotland. They'd grown up a bit, and Magnus was actually a salmon farmer at the time. And they were in the pub one evening just chatting about the news that day, and they'd heard what was happening in Bosnia at the time, kind of ethnic cleansing, and refugees were being made. And they just kind of sat together and said, what can we do in response? Like, we feel like we just really need to do something. And they were just youngish lads, and they decided that they would make a call around their locality in Dalmally for people to give aid. And what they'd do is they'd borrow a Land Rover and take it over. And they did that. So they gathered some aid, and they borrowed this red Land Rover, and they took it over to Bosnia to take aid to those refugees. But then when they came back, they found that actually people's generosity had kind of continued, and people had continued to send in their aid. And so Magnus and Fergus had to ask their dad if they could borrow the shed that you see there, to gather all the aid that was given. And because it had been given, they carried on making these journeys to Bosnia and then to other places in Eastern Europe and then further afield. And the Land Rover changed from a Land Rover to a truck, and they named this thing Scottish International Relief. And for the next 10 years, they spent their time going backward and forward to places where they felt there was need and taking aid out that had been generously given and stored in this shed. That was kind of the beginnings. Now, in 2002, Scottish International Relief that Magnus had founded had taken them to Malawi. And I don't know if you remember back in 2002, but Malawi was in the grip of a real desperate famine. And it continues to be one of the poorest countries in the world, but it was particularly in the grip of a famine at the time. And Magnus found himself there in Malawi. And he found himself in the house of Emma that you can see there. Oh, sorry to Facebook listeners, I've probably just banged around a bit. Magnus found himself in the house of Emma. Emma had been widowed the year previously, lost her husband to HIV/AIDS, and she herself was suffering from HIV/AIDS and knew that she wouldn't live much longer. And she said to Magnus, all I can do now is pray that somebody will look after my children when I'm gone. And I don't know if you can imagine what it would feel like to be in Emma's house hearing that harrowing story. But Magnus was there, and I guess in somewhat of a bid to lighten the mood, he struck up conversation with Edward. Now, Edward was 14 at the time. You can just about see him in the shadows. Emma's eldest child, Edward, 14. And so Magnus said, Edward, what are your hopes for the future? What are your dreams? What do you want from your life? I don't know, are there any 14-year-olds left? Or are they all gone out? I don't know if there's a 14-year-old there. I don't know how I'm not going to put you on the spot. But I wonder if you know any 14-year-olds and you said, what do you want for your future? What are your ambitions? I've got a good idea of what some of them might say. It might be to do with, I don't know, YouTube or football or money or one of those things. But Edward's response to that question changed the course of Magnus's life. Edward simply said this: I would like to have enough food to eat, and one day I'd like to go to school. That was the sum of his ambitions, that he would know that there was some sense of food security, that he would know he'd have enough food to eat, and just one day maybe he would be able to go to school. Magnus heard those words, and he knew that that was a call that he could not ignore. And so at that point in 2002, Scottish International Relief, as it was, became Mary's Meals, because Magnus knew in serving a generous God that he had to do something to give back generously to what he had received from God. And so Mary's Meals was born out of that conversation with Edward back in 2002. And just so you know, that shed there is Magnus's office. You know, some of these global organizations have big fancy offices for their chief executive officers. That's Magnus, and he still has his headquarters in that shed in Dalmally. It's just a tin shed. I've been up there, and I don't know if you know much about Scotland, but it's pretty cold. So that's the shed. So our vision at Mary's Meals is super simple, and it's what I love so much about our charity. Our aim is that every child has one meal a day in their place of education, and that those of us who have more than we need share with those who lack even the most basic of things. It's very simple. We feed a child in their school. Why do we do it in their school? Well, we know that education is the ladder that can lift people out of poverty. Now, for 200 million people's lives are at risk today because of hunger. Hunger kills more people today than HIV, AIDS, TB, malaria put together. But we know that those children might not be receiving a meal at home. If they know that they'll have a meal in their place of education, that's a brilliant incentive for them to get to school. But once they're in school, once they've had that hot meal, they then have the energy that they need to learn and to play together. We have this thing, don't we, in the UK, we say we're hangry. And I know I'm guilty. I am a very hangry person. If I haven't eaten, you do not want to mess with me. Like, we have that. It's a bit of a silly thing, isn't it? And yet these children, it's not just hunger they feel. Like, it's just they can't function. I don't know if you can function on no food, but I certainly can't. And these children, they know that if they come to school, they will receive a meal. So it's an incentive for them to get to school. And then it gives them the energy they need to learn and to play together. Incredibly, from 200 young people in Malawi just over 20 years ago, we're now feeding just over 2.4 million children every single school day. And that's amazing, and we do thank God, and we do rejoice in that number. It shouldn't be a number that we have to think about, but we rejoice that we can do that. Like 2.4 million, like that's because of God's generous provision. But the truth is 67 million children, just primary school age children, are not attending school in the world today. That's largely because of hunger, and maybe instead of being in a classroom, so many children are helping their mums and dads in their fields, in their farms. They could be scavenging in rubbish dumps, selling things to earn money instead of being at school. So 67 million children not in school. So while we rejoice and we celebrate that we're able to feed 2.4 million children, we're always striving to find the next hungry child. I've just seen on the banner, together we can reach the next hungry child. That's our aim, to keep the promise to those 2.4 million children that we are feeding, but to find the next. And from Malawi, in 2002, we're now feeding children in 18 countries across the world. And you know, the question you might be asking, and it's a question that I get asked a lot, well, do you feed children in the UK? Because we know, don't we, there's hunger here in the UK. Just as you've been gathering your boost bags, we know, don't we, there's hunger in the UK. Let's not deny that. But as Mary's Meals, we don't feed children in the UK. We specifically find the world's poorest communities where they just simply don't have the same safety nets that exist, like things like boost bags and food banks and all those lovely things that we shouldn't have, but we do have in this country. What's quite brilliant, I think, is that 50% of the meals we feed are to girls. In some of the places we work, culturally, it's not the case that girls will go to school at the same rate that boys will. That might be to do with cultural issues, it could be to do with early marriage, it could be to do with safety issues. But we're really proud to say that 50% of every meal we serve goes to girls. And, excuse me, because now we've been running for just over 20 years, we're now seeing stories, wonderful stories, countless stories of young people who've had Mary's Meals in their school. They've gained that education that has been that ladder out of poverty, and now they're thriving. And these are just two examples. I could literally give you countless examples, but this is Angelina and Mary, and they're in South Sudan. And they both received Mary's Meals when they were at school and went on to further education. And now they're both serving as auxiliary nurses in their communities in South Sudan, which is brilliant. But now they're actually both volunteers with Mary's Meals in their own communities too. And as you can read there, Mary's Meals has had such an impact on their life. They would have given up, Mary says, they would have just given up. They couldn't have continued. But because of Mary's Meals, they could continue. And now they are role models to the people around them. And we just heard just last week of other people who are now, electricians or teachers, or even a guy in Zambia I heard about last week who now has his own business making sausages. I mean, we need sausages, don't we? And so he's now got this business making and selling sausages, and he can support his family. And that's because of education. That was the key to his changed life. Just really briefly, I just really want to highlight some of the things that make Mary's Meals quite unique. First of all, we're community owned. So whenever we start a school program, a feeding program in a school, it's always with the whole community involved. We don't just kind of go in and start running things. It's always with the involvement of the local chief or the local elders, or the school staff, and most importantly, parents of the children. Because we know that for it to work, the whole community has to be involved from the very beginning. So the community is involved and the whole community benefits. In so many of our places that we work, it's not just the school that benefits, it's the whole community. Local farmers benefit because they know that they're getting a fair price for their food and they know that they've got a stable income. So whole communities are involved and benefit. Volunteer operated. Lots of people ask if we send volunteers out from the UK. We absolutely don't. Our programs run because of volunteers within the countries. So in Malawi alone, 80,000 volunteers help to serve these meals. So that might be, it's usually mums and dads who get up before dawn, walk to the schools, get the fires going, get the food cooking, get those big pots of nshima and porridge going. So it's voluntary led. Like it's not, Mary's Meals provide the food, the infrastructure and the training, but these projects are owned by the community and they're run very much by the community. And Mary's Meals has the same ethos here in the UK and in different partners around the world. If you've heard about Mary's Meals before today, you'll probably have heard it from a volunteer because we have very few members of paid staff at Mary's Meals. We have an army of volunteers who are doing things up and down the country, sharing the story of Mary's Meals, doing fundraisers, shaving their hair off, running marathons, whatever it is. We are very volunteer-led. and locally sourced. We don't fly food in, we source food locally, usually from cooperatives, so that people know that they have a fair income for their food, but they have that stability. Because we know we're going to be feeding children in certain schools, we can say to co-ops and producers, for the next year or for the next 2 years, we're going to lock those prices in so that whole communities benefit because they know they're getting a fair wage. And just, I'm really aware of time, but I just want to tell you one really beautiful story of a group of widows in Kenya, in an area called Turkana, which is a really rural area in Kenya. There was a group of widows, just a small group of women, who got together and were growing crops. And they were trying to grow their business and develop the business, but nobody would give them a loan. Because they were women and because they were widows, nobody would lend them money to get their business growing past what they wanted it to do. So they started to sell their vegetables and crops to Mary's Meals, to a school feeding program, and that grew and grew and grew. And now this group of widows are supplying food to the whole region. Like, their business has just grown because they knew, because they had that kind of solid investment that was there for the long haul. This is a figure that just astounds me still to this day, that it costs £19.15 to feed a child for a whole school year. And we think about global hunger, don't we, which we've talked about today. And I think of things like, 200 million lives at risk today because of hunger. And I find that quite overwhelming, actually. I find that a bit too much for my little kind of brain to deal with. And I feel really powerless, actually. When I think of global hunger, I feel like, what can I do? I'm just here in Shrewsbury, what can I do? And yet when I think of that figure, £19.15, I don't know if you've tried to go out for dinner recently, but you can't even go out for dinner for £19.15. And yet just that small amount can feed a child for a whole school year. And I find that absolutely incredible. There are many ways to give. Come and talk to me afterwards. If you want to get involved, do that. But I just want to kind of wrap it up. Excuse me, to go back to that theme of encounters with a generous God. The whole story of Mary's Meals is because of an encounter that one man had with a generous God and decided he wanted to change his life and do something because of that. And every life here, I hope, has had an encounter with that same generous God who's given so abundantly to us, so lavishly to us. And so my encouragement to you and my challenge to you today is, let's go out from this place with lives that are changed, and let's live generous lives. And this absolutely isn't me like shaking the bucket for Mary's Meals. This isn't about giving financially, not at all. But I just want us all to go away with that knowledge that we serve that God who gives lavishly to us. He's not stingy. He's never been stingy. He's lavish with his gifts. How are we going to respond to that? Will we give stingily? Is that a word? Will we give reluctantly? Or will we give of ourselves generously to that generous God that we've received from? Will we give with our service, with our gifts, with hospitality, with forgiveness, with grace, with all the things that I've seen so much on display this morning? Will we give to that generous God? As Zacchaeus responded in giving generously, sharing his wealth, as Magnus responded in giving up his own aspirations to serve God, what then is our response to God today? Thank you, Terry.